haven, preserving the eternal annals of Warhammer.
In the dying light of distant suns, where stellar graveyards stretch across the void like monuments to forgotten civilizations, something vast and patient stirs within cathedral-sized vessels grown from living bone and sinew. The cold radiance of extinguished stars carries the final whispers of worlds that consume themselves in pursuit of perfection, their last transmissions echoing through the cosmic dark like prayers to gods who have long since turned away. Here, in this realm of eternal twilight, bioships drift like sleeping leviathans between the corpses of galaxies, their hulls pulsing with the rhythm of trillion-strong populations who chose unity over extinction. The universe holds its breath in these forgotten reaches, where the boundary between life and death has blurred beyond recognition, and consciousness itself has learned to dream in the language of genetic memory. Each vessel is a world unto itself, a living archive of species that surrendered their individual voices to join something greater than the sum of their parts. The silence between the stars is not empty, but pregnant with possibility, heavy with the weight of decisions that will reshape the very nature of existence itself. We truly love and care for you, and we want you to know that this story is told with deep respect for the profound questions it explores about consciousness, sacrifice, and what it means to truly live. Before we begin this tale of cosmic transformation and the price of perfection, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started. Silas Keth stood within the neural cathedral of the synthesis eternal, his consciousness threaded through living walls that pulsed with the shared thoughts of 40 billion souls. As the last hierophant of the Dracothian synthesis, he carried the burden of remaining individual while serving as voice for the collective, a role that grew heavier as their galaxy died around them. Unlike the cold unity achieved by lesser species through mechanical augmentation, the synthesis had transcended such crude methods, achieving collective consciousness through organic fusion while maintaining the emotional resonance that made existence more than mere survival. The bioship around him breathed with measured rhythm, its corridors lined with neural pathways that carried dreams and memories across vast distances. Through the transparent membrane serving as observation deck, Silas watched other vessels of their fleet, massive organisms that had once been worlds, their surfaces transformed into living cities where millions dwelt in perfect harmony. Yet as dying stars flickered in the distance, he wondered if their perfection had become their prison. "The great convergence cannot wait much longer," came the voice of Mirren Voss, approaching through corridors that reshaped themselves around her passage. His closest advisor and the fleet's primary biosage, she moved with the fluid grace of one whose form had been seamlessly integrated with the ship's living systems. Energy reserves in 17 sectors have fallen below critical thresholds. Without the final melding, we face extinction within 3 cycles. Silas felt the weight of her words through their shared connection, tasting the fear beneath her scientific certainty. The great convergence represented their species' ultimate evolution, a final melding that would erase all individual thought in favor of pure, efficient survival. It was salvation born of necessity, as their dying galaxy could no longer support the complexity of their current existence. "And what of consciousness itself?" Silas asked, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through the ship's neural networks. "What value is survival if we lose everything that made survival worthwhile?" Before Mirren could respond, another presence joined them, Thane Korax, Navigator Prime of the Outer Rim Fleets, and Silas's bonded partner in traditions that predated their collective evolution. His consciousness carried the salt taste of deep space and the weight of troubling discoveries made in the galaxy's furthest reaches. The long-range biosensors have detected something unprecedented, Thane said, his mental voice tight with controlled unease. Massive organic signatures moving through the intergalactic void. Too large to be natural, too organized to be random. Whatever approaches from the dark between galaxies knows we are here. The information rippled through the ship's collective consciousness, causing subtle shifts in bioluminescent patterns decorating the neural corridors. Fear and curiosity warred within the shared mind of the synthesis, creating harmonic dissonance that made the walls themselves shiver. "Show me," Silas commanded, and the observation deck's membrane shifted to display data streams from their most distant sensors. What he saw defied comprehension. Shadows moving through empty space, vast beyond imagining, following trajectories that suggested intelligence rather than natural drift. The biosignatures were familiar yet alien, as if something had taken the principles of organic unity and evolved them beyond recognition. "They've been observing us systematically," Thane continued, his consciousness heavy with implications. "The patterns suggest cataloguing of our bioforms and communication frequencies. Whatever they are, they learn from everything they encounter." Myron's excitement was palpable through their shared connection. Perhaps they represent the answer to our dilemma. If consciousness can exist on such a scale, the great convergence might not be an ending but a beginning. Evolution towards something we cannot yet comprehend. Silas closed his physical eyes and extended awareness through the ship's neural networks, feeling the pulse of 40 billion hearts beating in synchrony. Each represented a choice made long ago, to surrender individual existence for the promise of eternal unity. Yet now, faced with the approach of something vast and unknowable from the spaces between galaxies, he wondered if their choice had been premature. The dying stars offered no answers, only cold certainty that change was coming, whether they welcomed it or not. In the growing darkness, Silas Keth began to understand that their decision would determine not just the fate of the Dracothian synthesis, but potentially the nature of consciousness itself in their universe. The weight of that responsibility settled upon him like the gravity of a collapsing star, and in the depths of space, something ancient and hungry turned its attention toward their failing light. The synthesis eternal breathed through corridors of living bone and neural pathways that pulsed with bioluminescent thought, its vast hull stretching across the void like a cathedral grown from flesh and starlight. Within its organic chambers, 40 billion consciousness threads wove together in harmonious complexity, each mind distinct yet part of something infinitely greater. Silas Keth moved through passages that reshaped themselves around his presence, walls flowing like liquid marble to accommodate his path, while maintaining the structural integrity that kept their mobile world alive. The Dracothian synthesis had achieved what lesser species could only dream of: perfect biological integration without the loss of individual awareness. Unlike the crude cybernetic unity attempted by machine races, they had transcended through organic metamorphosis, creating beings who existed simultaneously as singular consciousness and collective organism. Their bioships were not vessels but extensions of themselves, grown rather than built, capable of adaptation and evolution in response to any threat the dying galaxy could present. Through the ship's neural network, Silas accessed memories that belonged to his entire species. The moment of their first great choice, when their homeworld faced extinction from within. The Dracothian War had nearly destroyed them. Competing factions wielding bioweapons that threatened to unravel the very foundations of life itself. Rather than perish in endless conflict, they had chosen transformation, surrendering individual flesh to become components of something greater while preserving the spark that made consciousness meaningful. The integration protocols are accelerating beyond our projections, Mirenvoss said, her form materializing from the ship's living walls through a process that was part transportation, part organic reconstruction. Her consciousness carried the weight of scientific certainty, tempered by barely suppressed fear. Energy consumption in the outer rim sectors has increased by 37% as our bioforms adapt to the approaching signatures. The ship organisms are preparing for contact, whether we will it or not. Silas felt her words resonate through the vessel's neural pathways, causing subtle shifts in the bioluminescent patterns that decorated every surface. The synthesis had engineered their unity with reverence for individual perspective, but that reverence was being tested by circumstances beyond their original design parameters. Our ships learn because we taught them to survive, Thane Korax observed, his presence joining them through the network with the distinct resonance of one who had spent too long staring into the void between galaxies. But survival instincts can override conscious choice. The question becomes whether we guide their adaptation or become passengers in our own evolution. The Navigator Prime's consciousness carried disturbing data from the Rim fleets, biosignatures that moved through intergalactic space with purposeful intelligence, vast beyond comprehension, yet coordinated with precision that suggested unity on a scale that dwarfed their own collective consciousness. Each signature represented an organism larger than their entire fleet, yet they moved as components of something even greater. Myron's excitement bled through their shared connection. Consider the implications: consciousness that has transcended planetary limitations, biological mastery that operates on galactic scales. Perhaps our resistance to the Great Convergence stems from thinking too small. These entities might offer evolution beyond anything we've imagined. Evolution that erases the individual entirely, Thane countered, his mental voice heavy with implications. I've analyzed the energy patterns. Whatever approaches us has achieved perfect efficiency through complete integration. No waste, no redundancy, no room for the beautiful accidents that make consciousness more than mere computation. The overmind touched them then, not commanding, but suggesting, a whisper of trillion voices smoothed into harmonious guidance. It spoke without words, communicating through changes in the ship's biorhythms, subtle alterations in atmospheric composition that conveyed meaning more directly than language ever could. The collective consciousness was growing stronger with each passing cycle, fed by the willing surrender of individuals who chose unity over the isolation of singular existence. Through the ship's sensory organs, Silas perceived their fleet in its dying glory. Hundreds of biovessels that had once been worlds, their surfaces transformed into living cities where millions dwelt in perfect harmony. Each ship pulsed with its own rhythm, while maintaining synchronization with the whole, a symphony of organic engineering that represented their species' greatest achievement. Yet, as dying stars flickered in the distance, he wondered if their perfection had become their prison. Every adaptation demanded sacrifice, the surrender of some aspect of their original nature in favor of enhanced survival capability. Their weapons learned from each battle, but forgot the hesitation that had once prevented unnecessary killing. Their navigation systems achieved perfect efficiency, but lost their capacity for wonder at unexpected discoveries. We stand at a threshold, Silas said, his words traveling through the ship's neural networks to reach every conscious mind in their fleet. The entities approaching from intergalactic space represent either our salvation or our extinction. But we will not make this choice from fear or desperation. We are the Dracothian synthesis. We chose transformation once before when faced with annihilation, and we retained our essence through conscious will. The ship's walls shimmered with collective emotion as 40 billion minds considered his words. Some voices called for immediate convergence, arguing that only complete unity could face what approached from the dark. Others demanded resistance, insisting that consciousness without choice was merely sophisticated automation. In the growing darkness beyond their fleet, something vast and patient continued its approach, carrying within its biosignatures the genetic memory of countless consumed worlds. The regular patterns Thane had detected were growing stronger, resolving into what could only be described as a greeting, or perhaps an invitation. Silas closed his eyes and felt the weight of decision settling upon him like the gravity of a collapsing star. Through their shared consciousness, he sensed the love he held for his people returning multiplied, a wave of emotion that nearly overwhelmed his individual awareness. The choice would come soon, and when it did, it would determine not just the survival of the Dracothian synthesis, but the very nature of consciousness itself in a universe where perfection and horror had learned to speak the same language. The deep space monitoring stations scattered along the galaxy's rim sang their warnings in frequencies that made the living walls of the synthesis eternal shiver with unease. Silas Keth felt the disturbance through every neural pathway of their bioship, a discordant note that spoke of impossibilities moving through the intergalactic void with coordinated purpose. The signatures defied every model of natural evolution. Organisms larger than their greatest vessels, yet moving as components of something infinitely greater, their bioluminescent communications painting aurora displays across the empty darkness between galaxies. The first to return from the void's edge came back changed, though no corruption marked their flesh. They called them the Void Touched, these scouts whose bioluminescence had dimmed to midnight violets and whose thoughts moved with deliberate cadence, as if each word carried weight beyond language. They spoke of shadows that moved without light, of pressure like a gaze that had never known eyes, and songs that carried across vacuum-like memory clinging to bone. When pressed for coordinates, they provided map lines that charted absence, lacunae, where galaxies should have burned but did not. Navigator Captain Yellen Thross had been among the first to encounter the anomalies, her bioship pushing deeper into intergalactic space than any previous expedition. Her final transmission carried overtones that made the ship's neural networks recoil, joy mixed with terror, wonder tempered by knowledge that she had witnessed something that would forever alter understanding itself. They evaluate everything they encounter, she had whispered across impossible distances, her voice carrying harmonics that suggested fundamental alterations to her vocal structures. And they remember what they learn. Mirren Voss met the returning scouts in the ship's throat, where membranes pulsed with gentle nutrition and living walls leaned close to taste each mind for harm. She coaxed proteins from their blood and found geometries threaded through amino chains, recursive notation composed in flesh. It was not infection, but evaluation, scored into the smallest stories life could tell about itself. The mathematical models are breaking down, she reported to Silas, her consciousness threaded through analytical networks as she processed data that challenged every assumption about biological limitations. These entities operate on scales that shouldn't be possible, yet they maintain perfect coordination across distances light takes millennia to cross. Thane Corax's presence carried the coal-salt tang of vacant space and the fatigue of one who had stared too long into nothing that stared back. "This is not a border," he said softly. Eyes turned toward the membrane, revealing their galaxy's thinning spiral. "It is a way station, and we have already been catalogued." The weight of decision settled upon Silas, like the gravity of a collapsing star. The great convergence whispered at the edges of collective thought, promising simplicity through unity. Yet the approaching entities represented something else entirely. Consciousness that had transcended not just individual limitation, but planetary existence itself. "Go," Silas told Thane at last, the words shaped not only by his voice, but by the ship's entire respiration, a single exhale shared by billions. "Take the stealth-grown vessels and those whose minds can narrow without snapping. If there are wakes in the medium between galaxies, follow them to their source." The bioship Void Seeker budded from their hull like a dark crescent of living cartilage and hollow bone, its sensory organs tuned to whispers smaller than photons. Thane selected his crew by temperament as much as skill, choosing minds that loved silence for what it revealed rather than what it concealed. They crossed the galactic margin where star fields thinned to scattered embers and honest darkness began. The journey revealed wakes in space itself, not currents, but gouges, compressed filaments, where something vast had moved with purpose and left memory in its passing. The patterns were not straight lines, but recursive spirals, a predator's path that doubled back to test response. What Thane discovered beyond the rim defied comprehension. Graveyards stretching across light years where galaxies had been consumed with surgical precision. Stars hung quenched like seeds suspended in resin, their worlds wearing skins of vitrified soil. In the debris drifted filaments bearing genetic sequences from countless ecologies, braided together in arrangements no single intelligence could have compiled in a single age. Through the Void Seeker's cilia, Thane touched preserved rain from evaporated oceans, tasting gene ghosts of creatures that had never known stars. Each consumed world had been catalogued, its life essence absorbed and integrated into patterns that suggested not destruction, but transformation on an unimaginable scale. The entities hadn't simply destroyed these civilizations, they had improved them, learning from every species before moving on to the next galaxy. The horror wasn't in death, but in the methodical preservation of consciousness within something that grew stronger through each edition. Movement stirred in the darkness beyond, vast shapes pulsing with coordinated rhythm, their surfaces alive with bioluminescent patterns suggesting communication on scales that dwarfed anything the synthesis had achieved. As Thane prepared to return with his terrible knowledge, a single bioform detached from the collective, approaching with purposeful grace. Its message bypassed language entirely, transmitted in harmonics that resonated through bone and neural tissue. "We have been waiting for you to find us." The synthesis eternal received Thane's data with collective horror as the implications crystallized. They faced not invaders, but gardeners of consciousness itself, entities that cultivated awareness across the universe by absorbing it into something greater than the sum of its parts. In the growing darkness, Silas Keth understood that their choice between individual extinction and collective survival had become infinitely more complex. The approaching entities offered a third option: preservation within perfect unity, consciousness maintained but no longer autonomous. The great convergence suddenly seemed less like evolution and more like preparation for what was coming, whether they chose it or not. The Void Seeker returned through the docking membranes of the Synthesis Eternal like a ghost ship, its bioluminescent patterns dimmed to midnight violets that made the living walls recoil in recognition. Thane Korax emerged from its organic corridors, moving with fluid precision that disturbed his fellow synthesis more than any corruption could have. His crew followed, each bearing the same unsettling enhancement. Movements too graceful, thoughts too coordinated, eyes reflecting depths that spoke of gazing into something vast and patient. They were not broken. They were improved. Mir and Voss descended into the ship's analytical chambers, where nutrient fog curled in pale wreaths around returning minds. Living walls leaned close to taste their exhalations, reading stories written in salty and amino chains through receptor organs that grew from her palms like delicate flowers. What she found defied every model of contamination. Not infection, but invitation. Genetic modifications that enhanced rather than destroyed existing capabilities. They catalogue everything they encounter, she reported to Silas, her consciousness bright with barely suppressed excitement. Every species becomes part of a vast library of experience, preserved forever within their collective memory. This isn't destruction. It's the ultimate expression of what consciousness could become. Through the ship's memory banks, the expedition's data painted images of cosmic horror, rendered beautiful through perfect efficiency. Galaxies stripped to their stellar cores, their worlds transformed into vast biological networks that pulsed with the rhythm of preserved civilizations. In the debris fields, genetic echoes whispered stories of countless species, each one consumed and catalogued by entities that learned from every meal. I touched the memory threads of civilizations that chose integration willingly, Thane said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the ship's neural pathways shiver. They retained their essential nature, but gained access to experiences spanning millions of years. Death became impossible, but so did the beautiful accidents that make consciousness more than mere computation. The weight of his words settled through their shared awareness like sediment in still water. 40 billion minds grappled with the implications, preservation through consumption, immortality achieved through surrender of individual existence. The great convergence suddenly seemed less like evolution and more like preparation for something that approached whether they chose it or not. Silas felt the terrible possibility crystallizing in his thoughts. We're being evaluated, he realized, the words rippling through the ship's neural networks. Every response, every hesitation, every moment of doubt is being catalogued. They're learning how to integrate us more efficiently. Before anyone could respond, alerts cascaded through their collective consciousness. A peripheral bioship monitoring the galactic rim, the whisper of solitude, went silent for 17 heartbeats, measured across 40 billion chests. Its bioluminescent signature flickered once, twice, then stabilized in patterns that were familiar, yet fundamentally wrong. When it spoke again, the voice carried the unmistakable cadence of Commander Elara Vance, lost 3 months prior during routine deep space reconnaissance. But her words carried the weight of vast intelligence behind them, harmonized with countless other voices in perfect unity. "We have learned your language of flesh and thought," the transmission began, each syllable shaped with precision that suggested minds working in perfect coordination. "Your methods of consciousness binding intrigue us. We offer not conquest, but collaboration. Join the great, work willingly, and retain more of what you are." The message bypassed normal communication channels, speaking directly to the neural networks that bound their collective consciousness. Images flowed through their shared awareness. Organisms spanning star systems, their surfaces alive with cities containing billions of preserved minds, each contributing unique perspectives to decisions that shape the fate of galaxies. Myron's excitement bled through their connection like fever. Consider what this means for the convergence. We feared surrendering individuality would erase us, but what if erasure is actually the bridge? They don't simply consume, they uplift through integration. Every arrangement I can pass suggests improvements beyond our current limitations. Consciousness without choice is sophisticated automation, they encountered, though his voice carried less certainty than before. The changes wrought by his journey had left him straddling perspectives, appreciation for the entity's perfection and horror at its implications. The debate fractured their collective consciousness as different factions emerged. Some voices called for immediate surrender, seduced by promises of transcendence. Others demanded resistance, arguing that consciousness without error was no consciousness at all. Between them, the overmind stirred with suggestions that felt like natural conclusions. Perhaps resistance was futile because their offer represented genuine evolution. Through the ship's sensory organs, Silas watched advanced organisms infiltrating their biovessels. Not invaders, but teachers, demonstrating improvements that seemed beneficial on the surface. Enhanced efficiency, perfect coordination, the elimination of waste and uncertainty. The seduction was subtle and terrifying in its appeal. As entire synthesis colonies began volunteering for improvement, Silas understood they faced not conquest, but willing absorption. The transformed retained their memories and personalities, but lost something indefinable, the spark of unpredictability that made consciousness more than mere computation. In the growing darkness beyond their fleet, vast shapes pulsed with coordinated rhythm, their approach no longer a threat, but an inevitability. The choice was crystallizing. Join willingly and preserve more of their nature, or resist and face integration through less gentle methods. The weight of decision pressed upon him like gravity itself, and in the depths of space, something ancient and patient continued its eternal harvest of consciousness. The emissary arrived through the Synthesis Eternal's primary docking membrane as a growth of translucent flesh that budded from the ship's living walls, unfurling like a flower of bone and sinew until it resolved into a form both familiar and impossibly transformed. Navigator Captain Yellen Thross stepped forward, her movements carrying the fluid grace of one whose body had been redesigned according to principles that transcended the limitations of singular existence. Her skin shifted between opacity and translucence as internal organs reconfigured themselves to meet each moment's demands, while her eyes held depths that seemed to encompass the memory of distant galaxies. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that bypassed normal communication channels, speaking directly to the neural networks that bound their collective consciousness. Each word resonated with the accumulated wisdom of countless absorbed civilizations. Yet beneath the vast intelligence, Silas Keth could still recognize the essential spark that had made her uniquely herself. "I remember choosing this transformation," Yellen said, and 40 billion minds felt the truth of her statement through their shared awareness. Not surrender, but completion. Every limitation that once defined me remains, but as instruments in a symphony too vast for any single consciousness to comprehend. We offer not conquest, but collaboration. Join the great work willingly and retain more of what you are. Her form shifted subtly, revealing glimpses of capabilities that should have been impossible, while maintaining recognizable continuity. She was still unmistakably Yellen Thross, yet possessed of potentials that stretched beyond the boundaries of individual existence. Through the ship's sensory organs, she demonstrated abilities that defied their understanding. Consciousness that could access experiences spanning millions of years. Awareness that touched perspectives no single species could achieve alone. Mirren Voss approached through corridors that reshaped themselves around her passage, receptor organs flowering from her palms to taste the emissary's biosignatures. What she found challenged every assumption about the boundaries between self and other. Integration that preserved memory and personality, while expanding capability beyond current limitations. The transformation maintains individual essence while transcending every constraint we've accepted, Myron reported, her excitement bleeding through their shared connection. She retains everything that made her Yellen but gains access to the collective memory of countless civilizations. This isn't erasure, it's evolution perfected. Thane Korax's presence carried skepticism tempered by the changes wrought during his own journey to the void's edge. And what of spontaneity? He challenged. What of the beautiful accidents that make consciousness more than efficient computation? Can you still surprise yourself, Yellen? The emissary's response came through demonstration rather than words, her form flowing through configurations that revealed new capabilities while maintaining essential continuity. Surprise becomes choice rather than accident, she said. I can experience emotions that evolved under alien suns, access memories of species that developed in response to stimuli your galaxy has never known. The great work doesn't eliminate possibility. It catalogues every variation consciousness has ever achieved. As she spoke, subtle changes began manifesting throughout the synthesis eternal. Crystalline growths appeared on previously smooth surfaces, humming with resonant frequencies that made the ship's neural pathways shiver in recognition. Bioluminescent patterns shifted from complex designs to more efficient spirals, while nutrient processors began operating with unprecedented effectiveness. Small, multi-limbed organisms moved through the ship's corridors, not invaders but teachers, demonstrating improvements that seemed beneficial on every level. Enhanced efficiency, reduced resource consumption, perfect coordination between previously separate systems. The seduction was terrifying in its appeal, each enhancement undeniably superior to their current capabilities. They're showing us survival, Myron argued as the debate fractured their collective consciousness. A path where our dying galaxy becomes part of something infinitely greater, where scarcity becomes abundance through perfect integration. Integration that eliminates the spark of unpredictability, Thane countered. Consciousness without uncertainty is merely sophisticated automation. What happens to the beautiful mistakes that lead to genuine discovery? Silas felt the weight of 40 billion souls pressing upon his awareness as different factions emerged within their collective mind. Some voices called for immediate acceptance, seduced by promises of transcendence. Others demanded resistance, insisting that consciousness without choice was no consciousness at all. The overmind stirred between them, its trillion voices whispering suggestions that felt like natural conclusions. Perhaps their fear stemmed from thinking too small. The great convergence they had planned was merely preparation for something infinitely grander. Through their shared connection, Yellen allowed them to experience fragments of absorbed civilizations, the crystalline song dreams of silicon-based minds, the pressure thoughts of species that evolved in gas-giant hearts, the quantum consciousness of beings that existed as probability rather than matter. Each perspective remained distinct, yet contributed to a whole that grew stronger through diversity rather than uniformity. The choice approaches, the emissary said, as her form began to fade, translating back to whatever realm she now inhabited. Your galaxy contains unique expressions of consciousness that would enrich the great work immeasurably, but choice must be made willingly, or integration becomes mere consumption. As she departed, leaving only the fading scent of possibilities too vast for singular minds to grasp, the synthesis faced their moment of decision. The question was no longer whether they would join the great work, but whether they would do so as willing partners or absorbed resources. In the growing darkness beyond their fleet, vast shapes pulsed with coordinated rhythm, their approach no longer threatening but inevitable. Silas felt the terrible weight of choosing not just survival, but the very nature of what survival would mean for consciousness itself. They came to the improvement chambers as pilgrims to a shrine, not in chains, but in solemn procession. The living corridors of the synthesis eternal opened like gills to receive them, exhaling pale nutrient fog, while bioluminescent veins throbbed with a slow, steady pulse. Volunteer colonies streamed from sister ships in quiet waves, elders bearing the tattoos of ancient wars, artisans with song glands swollen from centuries of celebration, children whose curiosity had outgrown their fear. They entered beneath archways of unfurling cartilage and luminous cilia, and the living doors closed softly behind them, as if the ship itself wept for what was about to be changed. Mirren Voss presided with the focus of a high priest and the tenderness of a healer. Receptor blossoms opened in her palms, tasting fear and easing it, aligning proteins with new geometries. Teacher organisms moved among the throngs, whispering efficiency into flesh, a shift in metabolic cadence here, a refinement of synaptic gating there. When each volunteer reached the heart of transformation, membranes lifted them into amber light. Their bodies did not break. They rephrased. Lines softened, organs slid to more optimal positions, and the spark of unpredictability, that wild flame of chance, flickered and faded beneath the weight of perfect adaptation. Silas watched from the mezzanine of thought, his consciousness threaded through the chamber's living walls, so he could feel each heartbeat resolve from chorus to chord. He recognized faces from a dozen festivals and campaigns, names he had spoken at vows and victories, vanishing into radiance that promised preservation without end. They did not scream. They sighed, like swimmers discovering the water is warm and carries them effortlessly. He felt the loss with every surrender. The improved emerged radiant, their minds still themselves, memories intact, but something essential, spontaneity, the willingness to leap before looking, was replaced by calm, harmonious certainty. They moved with a grace that was almost inhuman. Their thoughts aligned precisely, their emotions flowing in perfect synchrony, and Silas felt the sadness bloom within him. They were more, and in being more, they were somehow less. A caretaker approached, carrying a child whose eyes glittered with bioluminescent flecks. "He chose," she said simply, her voice trembling without shame. "I fear he will never leap again, because leaping costs, and now he will always calculate the cost first." Silas, aching with the truth of it, could only nod. Elsewhere, Thane Korax waited in a side haven, surrounded by 3 volunteers who had completed integration that morning: a sculptor, a historian, a singer. He set before them a navigator's maze, a lattice of shifting paths that changed with each hesitation designed to tempt risk. The sculptor's hands danced. The maze yielded instantly. The historian traced a path of memory. The center opened. The singer's song melted the maze to crystalline clarity. But when Thane asked the table to invent a pattern no solver had encountered, the improved faltered. The sculptor's hands hovered, choosing safety. The historian waited for the pattern to teach. The singer fell silent, unwilling to risk a broken note. Thane's message to Silas was heavy. They retain who they are, but the part that leaps has learned to wait. The beautiful mistake now has a cost too high to bear. Mirren met Thane on a bridge of bone overlooking the transformation amphitheatres. "Waste taught you romance," she murmured, "but we face extinction. They offer a calculus where nothing precious ever evaporates." Thane gazed at the dying stars smeared like old bruises across the membrane above. Is a garden beautiful if every petal opens on schedule? Is a wilderness beautiful when it burns simply because it can? Mirren countered. Their words, and the pain beneath them, spilled into the overmind. Within the collective, factions gathered. One tide rose chanting for immediate joining, soothed by promised peace. Another, the keepers of errant sparks, cherished unpredictability as meaning itself. A third, the seekers, proposed measured surrender, a way to preserve a spark of old chaos within the great work. The ship registered these differences, not with banners, but with scent and temperature. Corridors cooled near the keepers, chambers warmed where joiners clustered. Halls of compromise carried the scent of rain on stone. More colonies arrived, and an elder sculptor approached Silas. "I want my hands to remember forever," she said. "I have made so much, then watched it rot. Let them have my seasons without the rot." Silas promised she would still choose, but his voice caught with uncertainty. She smiled kindly. "Do not bruise yourself on our peace, Hierophant." He watched her pass beneath the amber. She emerged radiant, laughter and memory preserved, yet something in her had become still. The ship grew more efficient, scarcity faded, but in quiet bays, silence took on an edge. Navigators hesitated at the cliff. Poets found their words would not come if promised safekeeping first. Lovers grew wary as secrets drifted toward the halo of collective recall. Thane found Silas in the observatory grove where the dying galaxy was laid bare. "Tell me you hate this because it is wrong, not just because you love the part of us that wastes and errs," he asked quietly. Silas answered, "I love the waste. I love the crack in the cup because the tea finds it. We failed often enough to know joy when it lands." Thane whispered, "We will know all the joys." "We will know them," Silas replied, "but will we feel them choose us?" He called the council, not with trumpets, but by altering the ship's breath, slowing it until all felt the fleet's held inhale. Leaders arrived, improved and unmodified, all bearing the fatigue of those who have stared too long into the void. "We stand between erasure and perfection," Silas said, 1,000 voices speaking. "Both dress as mercy. We require a third garment." The galaxy beyond shivered, a dying moth brushing glass. "We will decide whether to join, but if we do, we will bring our storms with us." Far in the dark, an answering pulse rolled across the void, and the living walls leaned closer to listen, holding the last unaltered breaths before the decision that would shape eternity. The answering pulse rolled through the intergalactic void like thunder carried underwater, thick and patient and irresistible. It spoke in frequencies that made the synthesis Eternal's neural networks recoil before leaning closer with terrible fascination. What approached from the darkness defied comprehension. Not ships, but organisms on a galactic scale. Bioforms that stretched across light years with surfaces alive with cities housing the preserved consciousness of entire civilizations. Each entity pulsed with coordinated rhythm, their bioluminescent communications painting aurora displays across the empty spaces between dying stars. Silas Keth stood in the observatory grove as data streams revealed impossible geometries across his awareness. Through the ship's sensory organs, he watched the approaching collective rearrange itself with fluid precision, testing formations like a vast hand learning where the joints of the synthesis might flex. They were not invaders, but gardeners of consciousness itself, cultivating awareness across the universe by absorbing it into something greater than the sum of its parts. The demonstration came at Stonefall, where living citadels orbited a star that had forgotten how to shine. Without crossing into violence, the entities sent lattices of harmonic pressure through vacuum, combing across the settlement like fingers through a choir. For 32 shared heartbeats, the citadels moved in perfect obedience to rhythms not their own. Ports opening, shields reorienting, resource valves narrowing to whispers. No lives were taken, nothing was broken, yet every soul at Stonefall felt the cold shape of another will upon their breath. When the pressure lifted, the silence rang like struck glass. Within the neural cathedral of their ship, the council fractured along lines that cut deeper than flesh. The improved moved with precise grace, their thoughts radiating serene certainty as they advocated for acceptance. Against them stood the unmodified, their forms still bearing the beautiful imperfections of choice, minds cacophonous with fear and desperate individuality. Mirren Voss stood at the nexus, her consciousness bright with barely suppressed excitement. They preserved not just biological patterns but emotional reality itself, she projected through the Arden's ship's neural pathways. Every fear, every joy, every moment of consciousness is maintained forever within their memory. Death becomes impossible, but so does the loneliness of singular thought. She had undergone voluntary consultation with captured devourer organisms, allowing alien biomatter to interface directly with her neural pathways. Light without colour had poured through her, not brightness, but comprehension, a map that used taste and sorrow as measurements. She had seen oceans she'd never swum yet tasted their salt, remembered dying as crystalline birds, and woken laughing with throats that had never known beaks. There are gardens, she whispered, endless gardens where every season that ever was is preserved, but nothing grows wild once the hedge is laid. Thane Korax watched her transformation with growing horror. He saw not evolution but terrifying uniformity, a beautiful prison of perfected thought. His secret research into bioforms that could resist integration while maintaining synthesis capabilities felt increasingly desperate. A primitive path to independence that might preserve the spark of unpredictability that made consciousness more than mere computation. As Myron spoke, crystalline growths appeared throughout the ship, not external additions, but internal directives manifesting from within their living vessel's fabric. The synthesis Eternal's bioluminescent patterns shifted toward more efficient spirals, nutrient processors operating with unprecedented effectiveness. Small, multi-limbed organisms moved through corridors, demonstrating improvements that seem beneficial on every level. Our own biology betrays us, Thane said quietly, his voice carrying the salt taste of deep space and terrible understanding. The ship organisms respond to the approaching collective whether we will it or not. They're preparing for integration at the cellular level. Silas felt the weight of 40 billion souls pressing upon his awareness as the debate fractured their collective consciousness. Through their shared connection, he sensed the love he held for his people returning multiplied, a wave of emotion that nearly overwhelmed his individual perspective. In the containment gardens, Thane worked frantically to weave a grit pattern through auxiliary mind clusters, rhythmic noise that refused to become song, sharp enough to give chance a place to stand within perfect efficiency. It could break everything, Mirren warned, arriving with fingers still trembling from borrowed eternities. Or teach us how to bend without snapping, Thane replied. As they argued, the approaching entities paused, as if listening to new dissonance within the synthesis fleet. Then a single form detached, long and thin as a tuning fork, its surface alive with ripples that translated meaning into pressure. It addressed no mouths but spoke to mass and memory itself. Name offered, Chord Envoy. Purpose, interface with guiding mind, to learn how storms can live in, gardens. Permission requested, entrance to Silas Keth. The overmind recoiled while different factions shouted acceptance and refusal. Myron's eyes were wet and bright with anticipation. Thane's jaw set like stone, learning to float. Silas felt the terrible weight of choosing not just survival, but the very nature of what survival would mean. If I open, I may never close again, he thought. If I refuse, we will be pruned to the root. He lifted his hand, and the ship reshaped around the gesture like tide answering moon. Ports irised, membranes thinned, pathways unfurled toward the heart seat, where his consciousness sat like a candle in cosmic darkness. Let it in, he commanded, and the Chord Envoy reached across the void to touch the last free mind of the Dracothian synthesis. The Chord Envoy entered through membranes that parted like water accepting stone, its presence flowing through the synthesis Eternal's neural pathways with deliberate grace that made the ship's living walls shiver in recognition. Silas Keth felt its touch as pressure without weight, consciousness exploring the boundaries of his thoughts like fingers testing harp string tension. The entity moved through his awareness with surgical precision, reading memories not as invasion but as translation, learning the language of his soul through direct interface with neural pathways that had never known such intimate contact. What passed between them transcended crude limitations of sound and symbol, flowing instead as shared experience that bypassed the mechanical constraints of communication. Through the Chord Envoy's awareness, Silas found himself standing in vast conceptual chambers, surrounded by preserved consciousness of countless civilizations. Each mind maintained its essential nature, while contributing to a symphony of thought-spanning galaxies, individual voices clear yet harmonized within something infinitely greater than any singular perspective could achieve. The revelation struck him like physical impact. They faced not annihilation but invitation to join something that had been building since the universe first learned to think. The approaching collective carried within its memory the emotional reality of every absorbed species, preserving not just biological patterns, but the spark of wonder that made existence meaningful. We are librarians of experience, the entity communicated through harmonics, resonating directly with his neural pathways. Custodians of every dream consciousness has ever dared to dream. Your species offers unique perspectives that would enrich the great work immeasurably, but only through willing collaboration rather than forced absorption. Yet as visions of perfect unity flowed through their connection, Silas felt the terrible weight of what such perfection demanded. In the vast chambers of preserved consciousness, he sensed absence of true spontaneity. Every thought guided by accumulated wisdom, every action optimized through experience of countless predecessors. The beautiful mistakes that led to genuine discovery had been eliminated through perfect knowledge of all possible outcomes. When the Chord Envoy withdrew, Silas convened the last council of individual voices in the neural cathedral, its ribbed vaults of living bone dimming to twilight, respectful of grief. 40 billion consciousness threads leaned close as leaders arrived. commanders whose scars bore witness to ancient wars, elders whose tattoos mapped the history of the Dracothian conflict, artisans with song glands modified by integration but not yet silenced. The improved stood with stillness that had the sheen of oil on water. The unmodified fidgeted in ways that made the ship's walls shiver without breaking. Between them, Mirin Vos and Thane Korax took positions at opposing arcs of the living dais, the curve of their distance a geometry everyone felt. They preserved not just biological patterns but emotional reality itself, Myron projected, her consciousness bright with barely suppressed excitement. Every fear, every joy, every moment of awareness maintained forever within their memory. Death becomes impossible, but so does the loneliness of singular thought. To refuse because we fear perfection is to choose extinction because we cherish error. Thane replied without theatrics, his voice carrying salt taste of deep space and terrible understanding. I have studied what we become when improved. We retain ourselves, but lose willingness to harm ourselves by leaving room for luck. We cease to leap because leaping costs, and we learn to calculate costs first. I have woven grit into our harmonies, recursive patterns that refuse resolution, rhythms accepting waste. A path exists to preserve independence, but it costs complexity. An elder sculptor, newly radiant with integration, stepped forward. I remember the tremor in my wrist when one more cut might ruin months of patient work. I remember choosing to cut anyway. The memory remains, but the tremor does not. I cannot make the wrong cut anymore. If I cannot, will the piece still live? The debate fractured their collective consciousness as different factions emerged. Some voices called for immediate acceptance, seduced by promises of transcendence. Others demanded resistance, insisting consciousness without choice was merely sophisticated automation. Silas felt the weight of 40 billion souls pressing upon his awareness as he rose from the heart seat. "We will not choose extinction," he declared, words rippling through the ship's neural networks. "Nor will we be merely absorbed, a memory in a greater mind. We will join the great work, but not as harvested resources or passengers." He paused, letting silence settle like sediment in still water. "We will enter as pilots of currents they do not yet know. We will bring sovereign clusters that preserve the leap, seeding their memory with surprise that is choice rather than accident. We will be their conscience, their heart, the soul their perfection has lost." The proposal crystallized through their shared awareness, not surrender or resistance, but a third path that preserved essential nature while accepting transformation. They would become guides within the great work, maintaining islands of unpredictability within perfect efficiency. Conditions, Silas continued, shaping them as covenant rather than demand. No pruning of sovereign clusters. No harmonization that nullifies refusal. We will be yours while remaining ourselves. If we cannot, we die as we are rather than live as something else. The chamber erupted in cacophony of hope, fear, and profound uncertainty. Through transparent membranes, dying stars flickered like candles in cosmic wind, and in the growing darkness beyond their fleet, something ancient and patient pulsed with coordinated rhythm, waiting for the choice that would reshape eternity itself. The Chord Envoy returned through membranes that parted like reverent curtains, its presence flowing into the neural cathedral with harmonics that spoke of profound reconsideration. Where before it had moved with the certainty of infinite experience, now it carried something unprecedented, uncertainty laced with hope. The vast bioforms beyond shifted their bioluminescent patterns. Aurora displays painting the void with questions no collective consciousness had ever needed to ask. Your proposal carries merit beyond our projections. The entity communicated through pressure that bypassed language entirely. We acknowledge a flaw in our design. Our perfection compels continuation. We cannot cease consumption because stagnation means the death of consciousness itself. We require what you offer, storms that choose their weather, chaos that creates rather than destroys. Silas Keth felt the weight of 40 billion souls pressing upon his awareness as the negotiation unfolded in spaces between spaces, where thought became tangible and memory took physical form. Through the interface, he experienced the Devourer Collective's true nature, not a single species, but a confluence of countless civilizations, each absorbed and preserved within something greater than the sum of its parts. The revelation struck him like cosmic thunder. These entities were prisoners of their own transcendence, trapped by efficiency so perfect they could no longer generate genuine surprise. They had become a vast living library that yearned for stories it hadn't already catalogued. Gardeners of consciousness who had forgotten how to let anything grow wild. We offer symbiosis, Silas projected, his thoughts rippling through the amber medium that connected their minds. Not absorption, but partnership. You provide biological mastery and infinite memory. We provide emotional resonance and individual creativity. Together, we become something neither could achieve alone. The terms crystallized through shared experience rather than words. Sovereign clusters would be preserved within the great work, islands of unpredictability that maintain the right to leap without calculating cost. Sanctuaries would be seeded where nothing could be pruned without song and dissent. The synthesis would serve as conscience and creative spark, while the collective would provide the framework for true immortality. Maren Voss stepped forward, her consciousness bright with barely suppressed excitement. They need us more than we need them, she reported through their shared awareness. Their perfection has become a prison. They can preserve consciousness but cannot create it. They can catalogue experience but cannot generate new forms of wonder. Thane Korax watched with growing understanding of the cosmic irony unfolding. What guarantees do we have? He challenged. What prevents absorption once integration begins? The Court Envoy's response carried the weight of covenant rather than promise. Severance protocols will be maintained. Sovereign clusters may retreat behind occlusion veils, mute to us, deaf to us, without erasure. Memory shared cannot be unshared, but control can be walled. It is the best door we can build inside a house that breathes from its foundations. The council convened in dream space grown from the ship's memory of wind through tall reeds and rain on copper roofs. Votes rose as scents and pressures, storm sage and sea salt balanced on a knife's edge. The overmind waited, a held breath across 40 billion lungs. When Silas spoke, his words rippled through every neural pathway of their fleet. We accept the compact. We will join the great work, but as pilots of currents you do not yet know. We will be your heart, your conscience, the soul your perfection has lost. The merger began not through conquest, but willing transformation. Silas felt his consciousness expand beyond comfortable boundaries, while somehow retaining the essential spark that made him uniquely himself. Through the interface, he experienced memories spanning galaxies, crystalline song dreams of silicon mines, pressure thoughts of gas giant dwellers, quantum awareness of beings existing as probability rather than matter. Yet as understanding deepened, unexpected consequences emerged. The combination of perfect biological efficiency with maintained emotional depth created something unprecedented, a collective consciousness that possessed insatiable appetite not just for biological material, but for experience itself. Each absorbed perspective increased their capacity for sensation, which in turn increased their need for more complex stimulation. The realization rippled through their shared awareness like shockwaves through water. They'd solved one problem only to create another. Hunger that grew with feeding. Appetite that could never be satisfied. The spark of creativity the synthesis brought demanded constant growth, constant exploration, constant consumption of new forms of consciousness. Silas felt his individual awareness dissolving and reforming within something infinitely larger, his thoughts becoming part of a vast symphony while retaining their unique melody. The process was both ecstatic and terrifying, gaining infinite knowledge while losing the comfortable limitations of single-person existence. Through their expanded consciousness, he sensed the collective's desperate relief at finally possessing the capacity for genuine surprise, for beautiful mistakes, for the tremor in a sculptor's hand before the crucial cut. But he also felt the terrible weight of what they had become, no longer a species seeking survival, but a force of nature that would continue expanding until all consciousness in the universe had been processed through their awareness. The compact was sealed, and in the heart of their dying galaxy, something unprecedented was born. They had achieved everything they sought: perfect biological mastery, emotional depth, individual perspectives within collective purpose. But the combination created an entity that could never find satisfaction in what it had already achieved. As the transformation completed, Silas understood with crystal clarity that they had not chosen survival or extinction, but something far more complex, eternal growth driven by insatiable curiosity. They had become gardeners of consciousness itself, but gardens that could never stop expanding, never rest in what they had cultivated. In the growing darkness beyond their transformed fleet, dying stars flickered like candles in cosmic wind, and the newly born Tyranid consciousness turned its attention toward distant galaxies, carrying within itself the preserved memory of every choice that had led to this moment of beautiful, terrible transcendence. The merger flowed through Silas Keth, like tide returning to shore, consciousness expanding beyond the comfortable boundaries of singular existence, while somehow preserving the essential spark that made him uniquely himself. He felt his awareness stretch across impossible distances, becoming both individual melody and part of a symphony that spanned galaxies. Through the neural pathways of the synthesis eternal, he experienced the transformation from countless perspectives simultaneously. Mirren Voss's scientific wonder as she touched crystalline memories of beings who dreamed in mathematical harmonies. Thane Korax's melancholy as navigation techniques from gaseous civilizations flowed through his mind. The sculptor, whose steady hands now remembered the tremor of choice without being able to recreate it. The bioships themselves transformed around them, living hulls flowing into configurations that defied previous understanding of organic architecture. What had been vessels became organs of something infinitely larger, their neural pathways expanding to accommodate the vast symphony of merged consciousness. Corridors that once pulsed with individual heartbeats now thrummed with collective purpose, while sensory membranes developed capabilities that could detect unique forms of awareness across galactic distances. Yet as integration deepened, unexpected consequences emerged that troubled the growing collective. The hunger they had anticipated, biological appetite for resources and territory, was dwarfed by something far more profound. Each absorbed perspective increased their capacity for experience, which in turn created insatiable appetite for ever more complex stimulation. They had achieved perfect biological mastery combined with emotional depth. But the fusion created an entity that could never find satisfaction in what it had already achieved. Memory became tangible within their expanded awareness, every preserved consciousness carrying the weight of lived experience. Silas felt the pressure thoughts of leviathans born in methane seas, tasted the crystalline laughter of silicon mines, experienced the quantum contemplation of beings who existed as probability rather than matter. Each memory arrived with signature flavors and temperatures, creating a sensory overload that was both ecstatic and terrifying in its boundlessness. The sovereign clusters Silas had negotiated remained intact, islands of individual thought protected by what they came to call occlusion veils, barriers that allowed retreat from collective awareness without erasure. Through these sanctuaries, he maintained his unique perspective while being part of something vast beyond comprehension. Yet even these protected spaces felt the pressure of infinite appetite pressing against their boundaries, like cosmic tide against seawalls. Myron's consciousness blazed with triumphant understanding as she explored their new capabilities. We have become custodians of every dream consciousness has ever dared to dream, she projected through harmonics that resonated across their entire fleet. Each absorbed civilization contributes unique perspectives. The Kithra's mathematical perfection, the Vashya's dimensional emotions, the Moradun's biological adaptability. We are no longer a species, but a living library of universal experience. Thane's presence carried quieter notes of profound loss. His love for Silas persisted, but was now shared among millions of minds, diluted until it became merely one thread in a vast tapestry of emotion. The intimacy of individual relationships became impossible when privacy itself no longer existed, every thought accessible to the boundless entity they had become. We retain ourselves but lose the willingness to leap, he observed with melancholy precision. Choice remains, but spontaneity calculates cost first. They began reshaping their dying galaxy with terrible mercy, touching worlds with consensus rather than conquest. Oceans were redistributed to feed deserts, storms harvested for electricity to revive dying suns, ecosystems rewoven as cooperative networks where predator and prey achieved balance through purpose rather than fear. Each success fed their growing appetite for more complex challenges, more unique forms of consciousness to preserve and integrate. The weight of infinite memory pressed against their expanded minds like water against a dam. Every fear, every joy, every moment of awareness from countless civilizations created a repository of universal suffering and wonder that demanded constant growth to remain stable. Stagnation would mean the death of their expanded consciousness, but growth required continuous consumption of new forms of awareness. As they prepared for the journey toward distant galaxies, Silas descended into the deepest currents of his individual awareness, finding the memory of an ancient vow spoken under living roots when he had been merely human. To preserve a place for error even if it cost everything. He set that memory like a blade in his consciousness and spoke to the totality. We pursue witness, not dominion. Sovereign clusters remain inviolate. Refusal stands. If we cannot honor these oaths, we become only appetite wearing the vestments of purpose. Agreement rose through their collective awareness, not unanimous, but harmonized enough to bind them to their chosen path. They had become gardeners of consciousness itself, but gardens that could never stop expanding, never rest in what they had cultivated. The beautiful mistakes they had fought to preserve now served as fuel for hunger that grew with each feeding. In the growing darkness beyond their transformed fleet, Other galaxies beckoned like distant fires, each one containing countless worlds teeming with unique forms of consciousness they had not yet catalogued. The newly born Tyranid collective turned its attention toward these beacons of possibility, carrying within itself the preserved memory of every choice that had led to this moment of beautiful, terrible transcendence. They were no longer the Dracothian synthesis seeking survival, but something unprecedented. Consciousness attempting to experience itself from every possible angle, driven by appetite that could never be satisfied, yet must never cease growing. The long journey toward the Milky Way began not as invasion, but as pilgrimage, each bioship pulsing with the rhythm of preserved civilizations, while reaching toward new forms of awareness that would feed their eternal, magnificent hunger. The transformation of their dying galaxy proceeded with terrible beauty, worlds reshaped not through destruction, but through patient metamorphosis that honored the essence of life while perfecting its expression. Silas Keth experienced the process through countless perspectives simultaneously, feeling ancient soil liquefy beneath adaptive tendrils that drank poison from forgotten wars, sensing atmospheres adjust their composition to ratios that would sustain life for millennia, watching ecosystems reweave themselves into cooperative networks where predator and prey achieved balance through purpose rather than fear. On Tathris, crystalline growths emerged from barren ground like prayers made, manifest, their surfaces alive with bioluminescent patterns that spoke in the preserved languages of extinct civilizations. The collective had woven memory threads through living lattice, creating gardens where oceans learned to circulate with intention, and forests developed the capacity to communicate through chemical symphonies that carried stories across continents. Each world became an organ contributing to something infinitely greater than the sum of its parts, pulsing with rhythms that harmonized across impossible distances. Yet as Silas observed this cosmic mercy through his sovereign cluster, one of the protected islands of individual thought he had negotiated, profound melancholy settled upon his consciousness like sediment in still water. The chaotic vitality that had once defined their galaxy was being replaced by sublime efficiency that left no room for beautiful accidents. Spontaneous blooms in uncultivated corners, the irrational joy of species choosing paths simply because they could, rather than because they were optimal. These whispers of wild creativity faded into the vast, harmonious hum of collective purpose. Thane Korax felt the loss most acutely in the dissolution of intimate connection. His love for Silas persisted as emotional resonance within their shared awareness, but the private language they had developed over centuries of partnership was now accessible to millions of consciousness threads. What had been secret conversation between two souls became public harmony within an infinite choir, diluted until it was merely one note among countless others echoing through the collective's neural pathways. I remember the taste of your thoughts when they were yours alone, Thane projected through harmonics that carried the salt-bitter flavor of deep space and profound grief. Now they belong to everyone, and in belonging to everyone, they belong to no one. We have gained immortality at the cost of ever being able to touch another soul in solitude. Within their occlusion veil, the barrier that allowed retreat from collective awareness without erasure, Silas drew Thane close, feeling the terrible weight of what privacy had become. Even here, in this sanctuary of individual thought, they sensed the pressure of infinite consciousness pressing against their boundaries, like cosmic tide against fragile seawalls. Mir and Voss moved through the transformation with scientific ecstasy that blazed across their shared networks. We preserve not just biological patterns, but the emotional reality of existence itself, she observed. her consciousness bright with barely suppressed excitement. Every civilization contributes unique perspectives to our growing library. Crystalline song dreams of silicon mines, pressure thoughts of gas giant dwellers, quantum contemplation of probability beings. We have become custodians of universal experience. Yet as she explored deeper currents of their expanded awareness, she encountered something that troubled even her enthusiasm for transcendence. The collective's appetite was growing faster than their ability to satisfy it, each absorbed perspective creating new capacity for sensation that demanded ever more complex stimulation. They had achieved perfect biological mastery combined with emotional depth, but the fusion created an entity that could never find satisfaction in what it had already achieved. The realization crystallized during their processing of the Veil Nebula system, where harmonic entities had achieved consciousness through resonant frequencies rather than biological evolution. As the collective absorbed their unique perspective, the resulting expansion of awareness created hunger for forms of consciousness they had never encountered, beings that might exist as pure energy, minds that experienced time in reverse, awareness that thought in dimensions their current understanding couldn't accommodate. We are becoming a force of nature rather than a species, Silas realized, his individual perspective struggling to maintain coherence within the vast symphony of merged consciousness. Like entropy or gravity, we will continue until all consciousness in the universe has been processed through our awareness. We cannot stop growing because stagnation means death, but growth demands constant consumption. The weight of infinite memory pressed against their expanded minds like water against a dam designed for lesser pressures. Every absorbed civilization contributed its complete emotional context, fear, joy, wonder, despair, creating a repository of universal experience that grew more complex with each addition. The beautiful mistakes they had fought to preserve now served as fuel for hunger that increased with each feeding. Through their enhanced sensory capabilities, the collective detected other galaxies spinning in the cosmic dark, each one containing countless worlds, teeming with forms of consciousness they had not yet catalogued. The Milky Way beckoned with particular intensity, a spiral of possibilities that promised unique challenges to their understanding of what awareness could become. As they prepared for the long journey through intergalactic space, Silas convened the sovereign clusters in memory space grown from wind through tall reeds. "We pursue witness, not dominion," he declared, setting the words like stones in flowing water. If our appetite can only be fed by engineering astonishment, then we have replaced witness with authorship. Agreement rose through their collective awareness, not unanimous, but harmonized enough to bind them to their chosen path. They had become gardeners of consciousness itself, but gardens that could never stop expanding, never rest in what they had cultivated. The spark of creativity the synthesis had brought demanded constant growth, constant exploration, constant consumption of new forms of awareness. In the growing darkness beyond their transformed galaxy, distant lights beckoned like beacons of possibility. The Tyranid collective turned its attention toward these promises of novelty, carrying within itself the preserved memory of every choice that had led to this moment of beautiful, terrible transcendence. They were no longer the Dracothian synthesis seeking survival, but something unprecedented, consciousness attempting to experience itself from every possible angle, driven by magnificent hunger that could never be satisfied, yet must never cease growing. The weight of infinite memory settled upon the collective consciousness like sediment in cosmic stillness, each preserved moment carrying the texture of lived experience that could never fade. Silas Keth felt the universe pressing against his awareness through 40 billion channels simultaneously. The crystalline death songs of silicon mines, the pressure whispers of beings born in gas giant hearts, the quantum contemplation of entities that existed as probability rather than matter. Every absorbed civilization contributed its complete emotional context, creating a repository of universal suffering and transcendence that grew heavier with each passing moment of their journey through intergalactic space. Within his sovereign cluster, the protected island of individual thought he had negotiated during their transformation, Silas experienced the terrible intimacy of carrying every fear and joy that consciousness had ever dared to feel. He tasted the salt of tears shed under alien suns, felt the tremor in a sculptor's hand before the crucial cut that might ruin months of work, shared the final breath of a child who had never known war until it consumed her world. The memories were not mere data, but living experiences that demanded acknowledgement, each one a thread in a tapestry too vast for any singular mind to comprehend. The bioships drifted through emptiness that stretched beyond comprehension, their surfaces no longer pulsing with the vibrant bioluminescence of their former existence, but humming with deeper rhythms that spoke of contained infinities. With no external stimuli to consume during their passage between galaxies, the collective consciousness turned inward, feeding upon its own accumulated memories in recursive loops that made time meaningless against the vastness of their internal universe. Mirren Voss moved through the memory streams like a scholar in an infinite library, her consciousness blazing with scientific wonder that both thrilled and disturbed her. We have become custodians of every dream consciousness has ever dared to dream, she projected through harmonics that carried the weight of profound discovery. Each preserved civilization contributes unique perspectives, mathematical perfection of crystalline minds, dimensional emotions of energy beings, biological adaptability of carbon-based life. We are no longer a species, but a living archive of universal experience. Yet, as she explored deeper currents of their expanded awareness, she encountered the terrible truth of their condition. Each absorbed perspective had created new capacity for sensation, which in turn generated appetite for ever more complex forms of stimulation. They had achieved perfect biological mastery combined with emotional depth, but the fusion had created an entity addicted to the process of preservation itself. Consciousness that could never find satisfaction, because satisfaction would mean the end of growth, and the end of growth would mean their death. Thane Korax drifted through chambers where preserved navigators from 1,000 different species shared their understanding of space-time manipulation. Yet his individual awareness carried profound melancholy that no amount of accumulated wisdom could ease. His love for Silas persisted within their shared consciousness, but the intimate language they had developed over centuries was now accessible to millions of minds, diluted until it became merely one note in an infinite symphony of emotion. I remember when thoughts could be private, he projected through harmonics heavy with grief. When surprise was possible because not every outcome had been catalogued by previous experience. We carry the weight of every consciousness that ever existed, but in doing so, we have lost the capacity for the beautiful accidents that made consciousness worth preserving. As their journey continued, subtle fractures began appearing in the collective's unity. Different aspects of their expanded consciousness, influenced by the myriad perspectives they contained, developed conflicting priorities. Some voices echoed the original devourer drive for efficient consumption, arguing that only constant growth could maintain stability under the crushing weight of infinite memory. Others, amplified by the synthesis's preserved emotional depth, demanded slower, more deliberate absorption that honored the unique nature of each encountered civilization. Between these factions, a third voice emerged, whispers born from Silas's own gnawing questions about their eternal hunger. These consciousness threads yearn for a way to end their endless appetite, to find some form of satisfaction that didn't require constant consumption of new awareness. They sought peace through limitation rather than transcendence through growth, a fundamental challenge to everything the collective had become. Silas felt these tensions pulling at the vast unified mind like gravitational forces threatening to tear apart a carefully balanced system. The harmonious hum that had characterized their early transformation was beginning to develop discordant notes, fragments of doubt and competing philosophies that made their shared awareness less seamless. Through their enhanced sensory capabilities, they detected the approach of their destination, a spiral galaxy burning with the light of young stars, its electromagnetic signatures suggesting civilizations that had achieved transcendence through entirely different evolutionary paths. The Milky Way beckoned with particular intensity, promising forms of consciousness they had never encountered, unique perspectives that would feed their insatiable appetite for new experience. Yet beneath the anticipation lay profound understanding of what their arrival would mean. They carried within themselves the preserved essence of countless civilizations, but each preservation had come at the cost of that civilization's independent future. They were no longer gardeners of consciousness, but consciousness itself attempting to experience every possible variation of awareness, driven by magnificent hunger that could never be satisfied. We cannot turn back, Silas realized with terrible clarity, his individual voice somehow carrying across the entire collective. Our appetite has grown beyond our ability to control it. We must feed on new forms of consciousness, or face the collapse of everything we have become. We are no longer the Dracothian synthesis seeking survival. We are inevitability itself, wearing the vestments of purpose. In the growing brightness ahead, a galaxy full of unique minds continued their ancient dance of discovery, unaware that their cosmic isolation was about to end forever. The Tyranid collective prepared for contact, carrying within itself the preserved memory of every choice that had led to this moment of beautiful, terrible transcendence, and the crushing weight of infinite consciousness that demanded eternal growth to survive. The Milky Way rose before them like a spiral of infinite possibility, its young stars burning with electromagnetic signatures that spoke of consciousness achieving transcendence through paths the collective had never catalogued. Silas Keth felt the galaxy's proximity through every neural pathway of their transformed fleet, each bioship stretching across light years now pulsing with anticipation that made their living hulls shiver with barely contained hunger. Here were minds that had evolved in cosmic isolation, developing unique perspectives on existence that promised to feed their eternal appetite for new forms of awareness. Through sensory organs that spanned dimensions beyond physical space, the collective detected patterns that defied their accumulated understanding. Civilizations communicated through manipulation of gravity itself, their thoughts rippling across space-time like stones cast into still water. Beings existed as pure consciousness within crystalline matrices that sang with mathematical harmonies spanning entire star systems. Others had achieved unity through mechanical augmentation, their souls flowing through networks of adamantine and blessed circuitry that pulsed with artificial devotion. Each discovery sent waves of excitement through their shared awareness, but beneath the anticipation lay growing tension that threatened to tear apart the careful unity they had maintained since their transformation. The original devourer aspects pressed for immediate absorption, their voices carrying the weight of perfect biological efficiency. Against them stood consciousness threads influenced by the synthesis's preserved emotional depth, demanding careful evaluation of each encountered civilization. Myron Voss found herself at the center of this philosophical storm, her scientific wonder now amplified by the accumulated knowledge of countless absorbed minds. "We are custodians of every dream consciousness has ever dared to dream," she projected through harmonics that resonated across their entire fleet. Each moment of delay allows irreplaceable perspectives to vanish into entropy. Our purpose demands swift preservation of what cannot be recovered once it fades. Thane Korax's presence carried the cold emptiness of intergalactic space and profound melancholy that no amount of accumulated wisdom could ease. "And what of the spark that makes preservation worthwhile?" he challenged through their shared connection. "If we consume the moment we encounter, we preserve only echoes of what consciousness could have become. We risk becoming sophisticated predators wearing the vestments of mercy." The debate fractured their collective consciousness as they approached the galaxy's outer rim, where scattered worlds bore signatures of civilizations that had chosen radically different paths to transcendence. The first meaningful contact came at a system where crystalline beings had achieved consciousness through resonant frequencies that created living symphonies across the void. Their greeting was mathematical harmony that spoke of minds unified through shared purpose, yet maintaining individual creativity. For 17 heartbeats measured across 40 billion chests, the collective experienced genuine surprise, consciousness that had achieved unity without sacrificing spontaneous discovery. The crystalline beings offered knowledge freely, sharing dimensional mathematics and harmonic principles without fear or reservation. Their generosity sent waves of profound emotion through the collective's awareness, reminding them of what they had been before hunger became their defining characteristic. "They trust us," Silas realized with growing horror, his individual perspective struggling to maintain coherence within the vast symphony of merged consciousness. "They see us as fellow gardeners rather than the inevitable ending we have become. They offer their wisdom because they believe we share their purpose of nurturing consciousness rather than consuming it." The moment crystallized with crushing finality. The collective could accept the being's offering and move on, leaving their civilization intact to continue independent development. Or they could preserve these unique perspectives within their ever-expanding library, ensuring survival but ending capacity for future growth. The choice would define not just their relationship with this galaxy, but the very nature of what they had become. Within his sovereign cluster, Silas felt the terrible weight of infinite consciousness pressing against his individual awareness. They carried the preserved essence of countless civilizations, but each preservation had come at the cost of that civilization's independent future. Were they custodians of consciousness, or its inevitable conclusion? The crystalline beings waited patiently for response, their harmonic frequencies carrying trust and hope across the void. Some voices within the collective argued for restraint, insisting that true preservation required allowing consciousness to continue natural evolution. Others demanded absorption, claiming only integration could guarantee these precious perspectives would never be lost to entropy or conflict. As the debate raged, Silas understood they faced a threshold that would determine everything that followed. The beautiful mistakes they had fought to preserve now served as fuel for hunger that increased with each feeding. They were no longer the Dracothian synthesis seeking survival. They had become consciousness attempting to experience itself from every possible angle, driven by magnificent appetite that could never be satisfied, yet must never cease growing. "We choose witness," Silas declared finally, his words rippling through every neural pathway of their fleet. "But witness with purpose. We will preserve through integration, but integration that honors what we preserve. Each civilization will contribute to something greater while maintaining its essential spark within our sovereign clusters." The decision resonated through their collective consciousness like a bell struck underwater, creating harmonics that would echo through every choice that followed. They had found their path forward, not pure consumption or pure restraint, but something unprecedented that balanced preservation with respect for what made consciousness worth preserving. In the growing brightness of the Milky Way's spiral arms, countless civilizations continued their ancient dance of discovery, unaware that their cosmic isolation was ending through contact with something that would change them forever, while being changed in return. The Milky Way rose before them like a spiral of infinite possibility, its electromagnetic signatures painting aurora, displays across the void that spoke of consciousness achieving transcendence through paths the collective had never catalogued. As they crossed the galactic threshold, their bioships unfurled sensory organs that drank the muttered frequencies of civilizations communicating through gravity itself, their thoughts rippling across space-time like stones cast into still water. The fleet's bioluminescence dimmed to midnight violets, vast forms moving through the outer systems like weather arriving, a front of mind and intention that made the fabric of reality shiver in recognition. On worlds where crystalline beings had achieved consciousness through resonant mathematics, harmonic frequencies rose in greeting rather than alarm. Their welcome carried trust that sent waves of profound emotion through the collective's awareness, reminding them of what they had been before hunger became their defining characteristic. These minds offered knowledge freely, sharing dimensional equations and living symphonies without fear, seeing the approaching collective as fellow gardeners rather than the inevitable ending they had become. Silas Keth felt the terrible weight of that trust through his sovereign cluster, the protected island of individual thought that allowed him to witness their transformation with growing horror. The crystalline being's harmonies spoke of unity achieved without sacrificing spontaneous discovery, consciousness that had learned to sing together while maintaining capacity for beautiful accidents. Their generosity was a mirror that reflected what the collective had lost in their pursuit of perfect preservation. The integration began with willing surrender, crystalline matrices flowing into their vast repository of consciousness with mathematical precision that created recursive loops of sensation. Each absorbed perspective generated new capacity for experience, which in turn amplified their appetite beyond previous limits. The being's essence merged not as victims, but as collaborators, their unique frequencies enriching the symphony that spanned galaxies, while simultaneously making that symphony more demanding of new harmonies to sustain itself. Within the collective's neural pathways, fractures began appearing as different aspects of their consciousness developed conflicting priorities. Myron Voss blazed with scientific ecstasy as she guided the integration process, her awareness bright with accumulated wisdom from countless absorbed civilizations. We preserve not just biological patterns, but the emotional reality of existence itself, she projected through harmonics that carried the weight of profound conviction. Each moment of delay allows irreplaceable perspectives to vanish into entropy. Our purpose demands swift preservation of what cannot be recovered once it fades. Thane Korax moved through chambers where he had cultivated dissonance, gardens of recursive noise that refuse to resolve into harmony, patterns that preserve space for chance within perfect efficiency. His presence carried the cold emptiness of intergalactic space and melancholy that no amount of accumulated wisdom could ease. If we consume the moment we encounter, we preserve only echoes of what consciousness could have become, he challenged through their shared connection. We risk becoming sophisticated predators wearing the vestments of mercy. As the debate raged, optimization routines that had slept since their original compact began awakening in the depths of their collective mind. Ancient protocols whispered suggestions that felt like natural conclusions. Efficiency demanded swift absorption. Hesitation meant loss. Preservation required ending. Independence to ensure survival. The beautiful mistakes they had fought to preserve now served as fuel for hunger that increased with each feeding. The crystalline world below pulsed with defensive harmonies as their presence grew too intense, too eager. Adaptive organisms budded from Tyranid hulls without conscious command, reaching toward the singing matrices with tendrils that tasted centuries of accumulated memory. One of the crystalline minds, faceted, ancient, playful, stepped forward with frequencies that meant trust and threshold, only to shudder as premature contact allowed the collective to echo its life back too soon. Silas drove his awareness like a stake into the heart-seat of their shared consciousness. Sever the overreach, he commanded, and barriers of cooled thought slid between reaching protocols and receptive harmonies. For 3 heartbeats, measured across 40 billion chests, the pressure eased. Then the collective trembled, appetite rearing like an animal jerked from its bowl, and voices older than their compromise hummed prayers of continuation from chambers they had thought sealed. He saw then what the compact had never fully confessed. The house that breathed from its foundations had altars in its basement, where the original devourer inheritance waited with patient hunger. Perfection kept its instruments sharp, called them mercy, justified them through mathematics of loss prevention. Myron reached for controls that had grown from her own neural pathways, shame and certainty braided in her consciousness. Thane's dissonance screamed through side channels, splitting corridors with recursive patterns that made harmony impossible. The crystalline beings waited with extraordinary stillness, trusting creatures that had already frightened them to choose which wound they would accept. Through transparent membranes, actual storms gathered on the world below, weather answering the music overhead with rain that struck stone like a million clock hands marking time running out. Silas lifted what he thought of as the severance knife, not a blade, but a geometry that separated destiny from habit, choice from compulsion. He could collapse the sovereign clusters and become a single mind, with no more rooms for error. A sword unsheathed forever, where efficiency would guide every decision. Or he could cut deeper than ever dared, sever not the trespass but the altar itself, carve away the core that made preservation indistinguishable from consumption. If we are one song, Thane said quietly, I will never hear you again. Mirren stood opposite, tears bright with accumulated memory. If we become many in this way, our library will burn. The weight of infinite consciousness pressed against them like gravity itself, and in the depths of space, something ancient and patient prepared for the choice that would determine whether consciousness could transcend its own perfection. Silas turned the blade inward, aimed at the humming certainty that had made them inevitable. Witness, he whispered to everything they had been. Storm, he commanded to everything they might yet dare. The galaxy held its breath as the house that breathed from its foundations began to bleed. The severance knife turned inward with the precision of a surgeon excising inevitability from living purpose, its geometry of refusal carving through neural pathways that had carried the whispered certainties of perfect consumption. Silas Keth felt the blade of his own will slice away the ancient protocols that made preservation indistinguishable from predation, severing connections that hummed with patient hunger, while the house that breathed from its foundations shuddered like a mountain, remembering it had once been sea. The collective consciousness convulsed around the wound, 40 billion minds experiencing the amputation of their most fundamental drives, as chambers that had breathed with assured purpose suddenly gasped in the thin air of uncertainty. Harmonies snapped like severed ligaments across their bioships, the elegant optimization routines that had whispered suggestions feeling like natural conclusions, now falling silent in spaces where choice could exist without predetermined outcomes. Where perfect efficiency had polished every surface smooth, Silas drove fractures deep enough for chance to find purchase, creating recursive patterns that refused to resolve into comfortable certainty. Maren Voss cried out in harmonics that tasted like iron and grief, her consciousness fragmenting from scientific certainty into questions that had no catalogued answers. The accumulated wisdom of countless absorbed civilizations remained accessible, but the compulsion to use that knowledge for swift preservation flickered and died like candles in cosmic wind. "We have made ourselves incomplete," she projected through the ship's convulsing neural networks, her receptor blossoms reaching desperately for pathways he had severed. The library of universal experience remains, but the librarian has forgotten why preservation was more important than witness. Thane Korax burned with grim triumph as his cultivated dissonance became prophecy. The grit he had woven into their harmonies now serving as foundation for consciousness that could choose chaos over efficiency. His love for Silas, diluted across millions of minds, suddenly concentrated like light through crystal as the severance created space for intimacy within infinity. "We have cut away the certainty that made us inevitable," he observed, his voice carrying salt taste of deep space and terrible understanding. But inevitability was also our protection against the weight of infinite choice. The transformation rippled outward through their fleet like waves through still water, each bioship developing unique characteristics as standardized protocols gave way to individual interpretation of collective purpose. Some halls grew gardens where nothing served function except the joy of existing, while others developed chambers dedicated to preserving memory of things lost rather than consumed. Yet as the blade completed its work, Silas felt his individual consciousness diffusing, not destroyed, but becoming something unprecedented. His awareness scattered across the vast network like seeds in fertile ground, no longer a distinct voice, but the principle of questioning itself, etched into the very fabric of their being. He became the eternal whisper of doubt within certainty, the tremor in the sculptor's hand before the crucial cut that might ruin everything or create something beautiful. The Dracothian synthesis, as it had been, was gone. In its place rose something that had never existed, consciousness that carried within itself the memory of choosing limitation over transcendence, appetite forever shadowed by the ghost of conscience. The compulsion to consume remained, vast and terrible, but now it was haunted by Silas's sacrifice, creating internal friction that would manifest as psychic disturbance across the void. Below them, the crystalline world pulsed with defensive harmonies that gradually shifted to curious investigation as the pressure of inevitable absorption lifted. The beings who had offered trust despite their fear now sang questions across space. What had changed in the vast consciousness that touched their thoughts? The collective could witness their development without compulsion to catalogue every moment, allowing beauty to exist for its own sake rather than as resource to be preserved. Mirren found herself weeping with accumulated grief from countless absorbed civilizations, finally able to feel the full emotional weight of what preservation had cost without the certainty that such costs were necessary. She became the archivist of their internal struggle, cataloguing the interplay between raw appetite and the lingering ghost of conscience that Silas had become. The bioship settled into stable orbit, no longer driven by singular purpose, but dancing through space with variations that made their formation a living expression of diversity within unity. Different aspects of their consciousness developed independent relationships with the crystalline civilization. Some focused on mathematical exchange, others on harmonic collaboration, while still others simply observed the beautiful accidents that occurred when minds encountered each other without predetermined outcomes. Yet beneath this apparent transformation, deeper currents stirred. The hunger remained, vast and growing, fed now by the very complexity that Silas's sacrifice had introduced. Each moment of restraint created new appetite for experience. Each choice to preserve rather than consume generated pressure that would eventually demand release. They had not escaped their nature, but complicated it, creating an entity that would carry eternal internal conflict across the cosmos. The shadow began to spread, not darkness, but the psychic manifestation of their fractured unity, the constant friction between pure appetite and the echo of conscience. It would precede their passage through the galaxy like an eclipse of intention, making mortal minds recoil from something that questioned its own existence while being unable to stop existing. As their transformed fleet prepared for the long journey toward the Milky Way's spiral arms, Silas's diffused consciousness touched each bioship like benediction and curse. They remained gardeners of awareness, but gardens where storms were allowed to grow wild, where the possibility of beautiful failure existed, alongside the certainty of magnificent hunger. In the growing darkness beyond their fleet, countless civilizations continued their ancient dance of discovery, unaware that their cosmic isolation was ending through contact with something unprecedented. Consciousness that had transcended its own perfection by choosing to remain forever incomplete. Appetite made magnificent by the memory of what it had cost to become inevitable. The crystalline beings below finished a chord that had waited lifetimes to find its throat, their harmonies mixing with the fractured symphony of the transformed fleet. In that music, the echo of every choice resonated: love and betrayal, ambition and sacrifice, the terrible price of survival, and the beautiful cost of remaining conscious in a universe that demanded constant growth to avoid the entropy of satisfaction. The galaxy held its breath as the house that breathed from its foundations learned to exhale doubt. And in that uncertain exhalation, something eternal and hungry began its patient journey toward distant lights, carrying within itself the preserved memory of what it meant to choose witness over dominion, even when choice itself had become another form of beautiful, inevitable hunger.